So good morning, everyone. I'm Kate Kite, the Continuing Education Coordinator for Illinois Heartland Library System, and I want to thank you for joining us this morning as we present grant writing tips and tricks for libraries. So just a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to our special guest speaker, Lesley Zavediuk, who I'm very excited to work with again. I have known Lesley for a long time, and so I'm really excited to have her present for us today. If you can, I need you to first and foremost make sure that you're muted. And then secondly, please turn off your video since everybody's joining on Zoom. That will enable things to just run a little bit more smoothly. Finally, what helps me, I like to put in attendance in L2 so you can get credit for attending with us today, especially if you are with a school library. We can offer PDH. We'll put that form in the chat here at the beginning and the end. But it is very important to know who you are. So if you can go to your box on Zoom and you see those three dots, and you down at the very bottom, when you click on that, is the option to rename. So if you can rename yourself, either your first name and your last name, or your first name and your library, that is incredibly helpful for us. And then we know who you are. So thank you all for joining us this morning. And I am going to stop my own video and mute myself and turn it over to Lesley Zavediuk. Thank you for joining us, Lesley.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk about grants today, and I was very excited to see some names that I'm familiar with, even if I can't see your faces. First things first, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I do have a little PowerPoint presentation to go along with the webinar today. So let's get that out of the way. Okay, excellent. Okay. And then I'm also actually going to turn off my camera just for the start of this because I have some notes and I don't want to be distracting, like flipping through my papers. So I will be a little bit of a disembodied voice, but I promise I will come back when we get to questions so that I can see and talk to all of you. So let me just do that quickly. Okay. So I've probably interacted with a lot of you in the past in some way, but I thought we'd start with just a quick introduction for those of you that may not know me. There we go. So I'm Lesley Zavediuk. Hi. I used to work at IHLS in a full-time capacity. Most of the time that I worked at IHLS, I worked out of the Edwardsville office, and I dealt with e-resources for the SHARE Consortium. I also worked with the eRead Illinois grant when that first started. About 7 years ago, I could no longer work for IHLS in the Edwardsville office because my family relocated to Greensboro, North Carolina. And then about 3 years ago, I started providing grant writing and sort of just general grant services to IHLS, which brings us to the reason I'm here today to talk about grants with all of you. And then just one quick fun fact about me is I like to say that in a previous life, after I received an undergraduate degree in theater, I worked in various wardrobe departments for film and television projects. So that's just a little bit about me. Let's go ahead and dive in. So today, these are the things that we're going to talk about. First of all, we're going to talk about where you can find grant opportunities. We're going to talk about how to write a grant application and kind of go through the process for that. Then I've got some tips and tricks for you that will help you as you go through that process, and that will also hopefully make your application stand out a little bit more as you submit them. And then at the end, we should have about 10 to 15 minutes for me to answer any questions or provide any advice. Kate has promised to monitor the chat for me, so please, can everybody, okay, I just saw in the chat that someone can't see my screen. Can everybody see it now? I just want to make sure.
Yes, I'll message with Laura. Laura, I will message you because I can see your screen.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to go out of that. But yes, Kate is going to wonderfully monitor the chat for me. So if you think of questions as we're going through the session today, please put those in chat. We're going to cover a lot of information, so I don't want you to like forget your question as we move on. And then at the end, Kate can pull those out for me and I can hopefully answer anything that I haven't answered already. And then one other little housekeeping thing real quick. I'm gonna go in and out of this presentation a little bit to share some other resources with you. I've got some websites to share. I've got some documents to share. But I've provided to Kate sort of like an additional resources document that she will send out with the recording and post with the recording when it gets posted on the IHLS website. And it has all of the information I'm going to share. So any links that we go to are on there. Any documents that we look at are also provided. So you will have all of that after today's session. So you don't need to worry about that. So let's go ahead and kind of dive in. So I know that a lot of you are operating on budgets that can't cover all of the amazing services that you want to provide. And that's where grant funding can come in. But before you can get grant funding for those services that you want to provide, you need to know where to find it. And you need to find grants that are good fits for the programs, projects, etc., that you need funding for. So we're going to take a look at that. I'm going to exit out of my PowerPoint presentation here, and I'll try to move slow so I don't make anybody dizzy. And we will go to the IHLS website. One of the best resources that you have right at your fingertips is this IHLS grants database. Once you're logged into the L2 website with your L2 credentials, you'll find it here under services, and then grants database. This is just a great resource for IHLS libraries because all of the grants that are included in this database are already targeted for libraries. So you can pretty much guess that your library is going to be eligible to apply for any of the grants that you see here. And it's also kind of a crowdsourced database. So there are several staff members who may come across grants in their work at IHLS, and most of the time those grants get included in this database. So I submit grants for this database. I know if Ellen comes across anything that's really good, she makes sure that it gets through the right channels to be included in this database, and our marketing and communications team. So this is a really good place when you want to first start looking for grants. The nice thing about it is you can filter by library type. So if you're a school library, you can select school. And then you can hit apply. And now any of these grant opportunities that you see here, are targeting school libraries. Now they might also be targeting other types of libraries, but you're not going to find anything here that a school would be ineligible to apply for. The other nice thing about this database is that you can sort it in a variety of ways up here. I usually like to look at deadline because I can tell you right now that if I saw this grant that's due January 31st and today is January 23rd, I'm probably not interested in applying for that grant opportunity because that's a little over a week from today. So unless I'm looking at the notes there and I think like, oh my gosh, I have a program that would fit this perfectly, I'm probably going to look at ones that have a deadline a little bit further out. When you're in this database, you can also just click on the read more button at any time when you see one that you are interested in applying for. And you'll get a little bit more information. And you'll also find a link to the eligibility requirements in the application. So this will take you to the grant maker's website where you can find all the information you need to know if that is a grant opportunity that you want to apply for. So then I've got a couple other free resources I wanted to share. Another great place to look for grants is through this Demco grants search page. Now, when you come to this page, you could just Google Demco grant search and it'll come right up. Or again, that link is included on the document that will be with this recording when it comes out at the end. You will notice that you do have to enter in some information. Just to save time, I've already typed my stuff in. But I did want to let you know that I have used this database a lot, and I've never received like tons of follow-up emails or like sales emails or anything like that. So you don't really have to worry about that, I don't think, with this one. Um, and then you can select institution. I almost always click other. And you can choose one of these categories. I'm always looking for grants for libraries, so I almost always select library. But then I also typically will select a couple of these other categories. So maybe your library is thinking of doing some kind of after school program that has to do with STEM. I would absolutely click the STEM category. I might even also click technology. Maybe your library would like to have better security cameras and there's no way you can fit that into your budget, so you're looking for a grant for that. Or maybe you need new special flooring in the children's department. Then you might want to click on this facilities and maintenance category. You can click as many of these or as few of these as you like, and then you can just click search. Oh, and it doesn't want to work for me. So that's okay. I'll just go back so we don't have to see all that code. It did this to me once before. But it's very much like the IHLS grants database. Basically, you'll be taken to a page where there are a list of grants. It'll show you who the grant maker is. It'll give you a little summary about what the grant is for, and then it's organized in order by deadline. With the Demco grants database, you can't really filter it or sort it in any other way. It's just by date. But the nice thing about this one is it also very clearly lists exactly how much each grant is. So it'll give you the amount that the grant will be providing should you apply for it, which can be good information because if you're applying for a grant to maybe expand your summer reading program, but you're just going to do like an extra program with summer reading, maybe you're going to hire a speaker, or maybe you're going to provide some extra materials for a special program, and you know it's not going to cost very much. Maybe it's going to cost less than $2,000. You don't want to look for a grant that is actually awarding $10,000. And vice versa. If you know you're doing a program where maybe you need to buy laptops, or you have a project that you want to buy laptops for and you need grant funding for that, you're not going to want to apply for just like a $1,500 grant because it's probably going to cost more than that. And then there are a couple other free resources I want to share just because they're so easy to use. So one of them is this library grants blog. This certainly isn't a comprehensive list of grants for libraries. Not everything that's available gets posted here. But the nice thing about this one is you can just subscribe by email, and then any new grant opportunity that's posted here comes straight to your inbox. So you'll be able to read it in your inbox, click on links to get more info, or just delete it if it's not something that you're interested in. And then another one I like that is the Philanthropy News Digest. So this is a blog that's provided by a subscription database called Candid, but it's free to look at. And basically on this blog, they allow grant makers and nonprofit organizations to post any sort of calls for applications and grant opportunities that they may have. So again, on this one, you can sign up for email alerts if you like. I think it'll just have you put in your email and then you can pick like categories that you are interested in. I like to just visit this website once a week and kind of scroll through and see what the opportunities are. Much like our other resources, it's going to give you information about each grant opportunity, when those grant opportunities are due, things like that. The reason I always like to suggest this one is because I think it lets you cast a little bit of a wider net. So I've definitely found private foundation grants here that we thought were a good fit for a project that IHLS was going to do. And I don't know that I would have seen those grant opportunities in any of the other databases that I look for. Plus, it kind of lets you cross-reference categories. So again, like that Demco search, you know you want a grant that a library is eligible to apply for, but maybe you're doing a technology program and you might find a technology grant that isn't necessarily targeted at libraries, but that would be a good fit for that program. And then last not least, I'm sure all of you are familiar with grants.gov, so we won't spend too much time on that. Once you go to the grants.gov website, you just have to click on search grants to get to this page that I'm on. This is the best place to look for federal sources of funding. So if you need to fund a really big project, maybe you need a capital improvement to your building, maybe you've got a great idea for a really far-reaching, impactful program, this is the place where you're going to want to look for that. I do like to filter down as much as possible because this is very overwhelming. Any federal department that offers grant making or offers grants is listed in this database. So I usually right off the bat kind of scroll down and make sure that I check grant because that's usually the only kind of funding that I'm really interested in, especially as I'm looking for funding for libraries. And then it's really helpful if you have any kind of keyword that you can type in up here. So most of the time I'm just doing like a general keyword search for library in this database. IHLS was looking for grant opportunities for the mobile memory lab over the last year or so. And so sometimes I've searched this database with words like digitization or the keyword of archives, just anything that you think fits with whatever it is you're wanting to fund, you can use for a keyword search. And then you'll get far better results that aren't quite so overwhelming to look through. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go back to my presentation here. So now you've got a good idea of some places that you can go to where you can find grants that are totally free for you to use, which is very helpful. Now we need to talk about how you write a grant application. So writing a grant application can be super intimidating. There's a lot of requirements. It can take quite a bit of time. But the one thing you need to know is the more you do it, the easier it gets. So the first thing you need to think about is where am I going to start if I'm looking for grant funding for my library? Well, typically it all starts with a good idea. So before you even start looking for a grant, you need to have an idea of what you're trying to do with any grant funds that you might be awarded. You might have a great idea for a new program your library could provide based on the population you serve. Or maybe you've noticed a problem in your community that you think the library could provide a solution for if you had additional resources. Or maybe it's just as simple as the summer reading theme is a really good theme and you've got a perfect idea for an extra program you could do, but it's just not going to fit in that budget. So once you have that good idea, it's really helpful to start thinking about details right away. You actually want to think about some details before you look for a grant opportunity that is a good fit for that idea. So a great way to do that is to use what's called a project process form. Now this comes from project management kind of stuff, and I have an example that I can show you. So this is one that we created for IHLS. And when we were looking for funding for the mobile memory lab, about a year and a half ago, we did write a successful grant application for the IHLS mobile memory lab to Illinois Humanities. But before we even found that grant opportunity, we had a couple of brainstorming meetings where we basically filled out this form. So if you can answer even just a few of these questions before you start looking for a grant, it's going to help you find an opportunity that's going to be a really good fit for whatever it is you're trying to fund. And you can see it's really pretty basic. When we come up with a good idea, we usually give it some sort of name so that we can refer to it when we're talking about it. So you can include that. It doesn't have to be written in stone. I always like to start thinking immediately about my start date because that's going to inform which grants I can apply for, because I don't want to apply for something where the deadline is or the grant is going to be awarded beyond or not before that start date. Project team. Now, I know some of you, if you're at a small library and you're the library director, then you are the project team. So that field may not be useful to you. But even if it's just you and the children's librarian, or maybe you and someone in your genealogy department, or if you're working with another organization, it can be good to sort of think about who's going to help you do this program and write this grant application. And then these are kind of the most important things that I want you to think about before you look for grant opportunities. One is I already want you to start thinking about deliverables. So I want you to think about anything that you are going to need to make your program happen. The other thing that's really important to start thinking about right away is your target population or audience. Almost every single grant application is going to ask you a question about how you're going to serve your audience and who your audience is. And grant makers really want you to be specific. So you want to think about which patrons are going to benefit most from whatever it is you're trying to get grant funding for. Or if you think that your program is going to benefit all patrons, you need to start thinking about what is special about the patrons that you serve. So I put just a few example questions there. You might want to think about, are you in a rural area? Are all the patrons that you serve in that rural area with you? Do you serve a population that is elderly? Do you have a bunch of homebound patrons and you think that this program would be a benefit to them? You can think about if your population is underserved in some way. Maybe you have a certain percentage of households that you serve that are below the poverty level. These are all important things to start thinking about before you look for grant opportunities. And then a lot of these other questions you may fill out, you may really be brainstorming and doing good work and thinking about, and some of them you may leave blank and then come back and revisit, and that's fine. You also want to start thinking about, like, what do I already have at the library that will help me achieve this goal? And what external resources am I going to need? And then finally, pretty early on, I want you to already start thinking about how much funding you need. So this is just an estimate. I don't want you to look at this form and then run off and start researching exactly what things cost and how much you would have to pay for the supplies that you need for your program. But if you're thinking to yourself, I'm going to be doing a program at my library where I'm going to need laptops for patrons to use. I know off the bat, I'm going to need at least 5 laptops. And I know that laptops are going to be, each of those laptops is probably going to be around $1,000, if not more. So then I can kind of come up with a range and say, okay, well, then I'm also probably going to need maybe more extension cords, or I know that I'm going to have printing costs because I'm going to print out instructions, or I'm going to have promotional flyers. You can kind of come up with just a really basic range. And again, that's important because if I know this grant program that I want to do is going to cost at least $8,000, I don't want to apply for a $2,000 grant, and vice versa. If I am going to spend at least $8,000 to make this program happen, I don't want to apply for like one of those federal grants that's $100,000, because it's just, they're not going to award me that funding because it doesn't really fit in with their requirements. And then if you get a chance, you'll want to start thinking about you can start thinking about implementation. So if I got awarded this money tomorrow, what would I have to do to make this grant program happen? We used this when we applied for that grant just to do some brainstorming. And I think it's just a really good way to sort of organize your thoughts. And again, this is included in that additional resources document that Kate will share with the recording. So you can use it how you see fit. It's yours to look at and use. Okay, so once you've found a grant that you think is one you should apply for, the next step is to determine what the funder is going to want to see in the application. So the way that you do that is you can do that by reading through the NOFO, or the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Now, I'm going to keep referring to it as a NOFO just to limit confusion, but basically what I'm talking about is just the guidelines from the grant maker about what they expect to see in a grant application. This is called a variety of things. So if you're applying for a federal grant, it's almost always called a NOFO, or a Notice of Funding Opportunity. If you're applying for a private foundation grant, it might just be called an RFP, like a request for proposal. Sometimes in the corporate world, it's just a call for proposals. But any of these documents are going to tell you what you need to include in your grant application. Now, NOFOs can vary widely in how detailed they are. So I'm going to show a couple of examples here in just a minute. But as a best practice, I like to read through a NOFO 3 times. I read through it once, start to finish. Then a little later on, I usually read through it again and highlight important information. And then the third time, I write down any questions or notes that I have. By that time, you're going to be really familiar with what the grant maker is wanting you to include in your grant application. So let's look at a couple of examples here. The first one that I have is a NOFO from an NHPRC grant called Public Engagement with Historical Records. IHLS did apply for this grant last year in hopes that we could expand the mobile memory lab, and this is the NOFO. Now, this one is only 7 pages, but I have seen federal grant NOFOs that are upwards of 50 pages, so they can be very detailed. And typically, you're going to download it from that grants.gov website, and it's going to be like a big PDF. I actually had to cut and paste this information from a couple of different places just so that we could have it all in one place. But this is what you're going to find in a NOFO, and these are the things that you want to pay attention to. It's always going to tell you the deadline. That's very important information. Sometimes there's going to be a contact. This is also very important information, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So just keep that in mind. There's going to be a great description of what the grant maker actually is wanting to fund. So this is where you're going to be reading through this information and you're going to say, oh my gosh, this fits perfectly with my really good idea for the program that I want to do at my library. And then we'll just go through a little bit more here. Let's just scroll. Okay. It's always going to tell you how much is going to be awarded, sort of like the timeline. This section will be included in any NOFO that you look at about eligible applicants. And this is one of the most important things that you want to look at first before you decide if you want to apply for that grant. If your library doesn't fall into these eligibility requirements, this is not a grant opportunity for you. So most often with libraries, where this comes into play is the grant maker may have an eligibility requirements that you must be a 501c3. If your library has a friends group, great. Your friends group can actually apply for that grant because they have 501c3 status. Or if you happen to be a library that has 501c3 status, great. You are eligible to apply. Occasionally, you can use a fiscal sponsor, so you could partner with an organization that also has 501c3 status to apply in these eligibility requirements, but that's usually listed very explicitly in the NOFO. And if you don't see that and you don't have sort of any other way, like through a friends group or 501(c)(3) status of your own, then you probably don't want to apply for this grant, because you're going to take a lot of time to write an application. And as soon as they go through their first review, they're going to put you in the do not read further pile because you don't meet those requirements that they set out. So that's the one that I really, when you first look at the NOFO, that's what you want to pay attention to the most. And then it's going to have a lot of other information. There's usually some budget information. There's usually some information about how you're actually going to fill out the application. And then it's going to give you a really good detailed overview of what you're actually going to have to write into that grant application to submit it. So a lot of times it's going to have a project narrative section, and that can include all sorts of components. Usually you're going to have an overview of your program. You might usually have to have a description of your organization. Sometimes you might need a plan of work. There's all sorts of different components that grant makers ask for in their applications. And these are all things you want to start kind of thinking about right away if you think this is a grant opportunity you want to apply for. And then They're also going to include like supplementary materials. Sometimes you have to upload a whole lot of extra documents, and sometimes you don't have to add anything except for that narrative. It just depends. So that's a really detailed NOFO. I did also want to show you an example of one that's not so detailed. So another grant that IHLS applied for last year was an EBSCO solar grant to see if we could get solar panels on the Edwardsville hub. And this is pretty much their NOFO. All it has are some basic guidelines about what they expect from grant applicants. These would be your eligibility requirements under optimal candidates. And then it goes straight to exactly what's going to be on the application. So again, as soon as you scroll down here a little bit, you see that project narrative again, and they tell you what components they expect you to include when you write that. And then they also need some additional attachments. So they are definitely going to require a cover letter. That's not rare. A lot of grant makers want a cover letter with their grant application. They want you to have photos, and they tell you what those photos are. And then financial attachments. That's another one that you're going to see a lot with any grant app or opportunity that you apply for. So those are just a couple of examples of kind of what NOFOs can look like. It's good to just read through them to kind of become familiar with some of the terminology, because a lot of this you're going to find in most grant opportunities that you're looking for. So next up, depending on how detailed the grant application is, you may want to have a kickoff meeting. So I also have a template for that just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. And this is included in that document that I shared with Kate to go with the recording. But it can be really helpful to have a kickoff meeting, whether you're doing a super big grant project or a smaller one. Because again, it's just going to help you kind of talk through your thoughts. Some of this you could pull immediately from that project process form if you filled it out. But usually if I'm going to have a meeting about before I start writing the application, I'm going to write down any questions that I have so that we can talk about those as kind of like a team and figure out how we might answer them. I'm going to make sure I've listed out all those project narrative requirements so I know exactly what it is we're going to have to write. And then the most important part, I think, is starting to come up with kind of like a schedule for writing your grant application. So you're going to know the final submission deadline just from looking at that NOFO. And then I usually kind of work backwards. So I'll think to myself, okay, well, I'm probably going to have at least one rough draft that I'm going to want to tweak. So I'll give myself a date that I want that rough draft done. And then if there's extra components, for the NHPRC grant that IHLS wrote, we actually had to get letters of support. So one of the first things that I looked at on the calendar was, okay, well, we're going to have to contact organizations. We're going to have to give them time to write these letters of support, and then we're going to have to get them back. So I looked at the calendar and came up with a deadline for that. And then also if you need any extra meetings. So like I said, having a meeting like this can be incredibly helpful if you're looking at a big grant application, but it can also be useful for organizing your thoughts if it's just you and the youth librarian and you're applying for a grant to fund a children's program. Again, you don't have to fill out everything on this. This is just a working document for you. But once you have notes, after you've thought through all this stuff, you have one more thing to pull from when you actually start writing the grant application. So we did a kickoff meeting for that NHPRC grant. By the time we were done with it, this document was far longer because I wrote all sorts of notes all over it during our meeting. And then I also had something I was able to send out to anybody who was going to be involved in the grant writing process to kind of keep everybody on task. Let me just quickly go back to my presentation here. So now you've found a grant opportunity, you've looked at the NOFO and decided it's a really great fit for whatever it is you're trying to fund. You've looked at all the grant application requirements and you have a really good idea of what you're going to need to do to submit that grant application. So now it's time to start writing it. Most grant applications are going to start with just basic organizational information that you have to fill in. Then there's usually like a project summary or an executive summary, then a more detailed project narrative, which we looked at in both of those NOFOs we examined, and a budget. Your instinct is going to be to just dive right in and start filling out that grant application from start to finish. But I'm going to urge you to work backwards and actually start with your budget. Why, you might ask? Well, typically budgeting is one of the least favorite things that people have to do. There are people that love budgeting, and those people are amazing. But it can be very time consuming. It can seem complicated, and not everyone loves numbers. So it's a good idea to just get the budgeting out of the way, because that's probably one of the harder things you're going to have to do. Plus, as you start thinking about your budget and understanding what you would need to spend grant funds on, you're actually also going to start getting better ideas about how you're going to implement your program or project or whatever it is you're going to do with those grant funds. So once you start getting more ideas about that, those are things you can include in your project narrative. We could do a whole webinar on how to create a budget for a grant application, and we don't have time for that today. But I did just have one quick resource to share with you that might help you out. So let me pull that up quickly. This is just a blog. Instrumental is actually a subscription service for grant writers that helps with grant management and grant writing and all sorts of other stuff. But again, like some of the other resources I've shared, their blog is free and it has tons of resources that are really helpful, whether you have never written a grant before and you're just kind of getting your feet wet, or whether you've written several and you just feel like you need, more tips to make your grant writing better. So again, this link will be shared on that document that you'll have with the recording. But it's just a really great article that details all the different kind of grant budgets that you might see or that might be required from you as you fill out grant applications. And then if you scroll down to the end, it's actually got some free templates that you can just download. They're just Google spreadsheets. You may already have spreadsheets that you like to use for budgeting, especially as you do your library budget. And that's fine. Those are a great way to start budgeting as well. You can just use one of those spreadsheets and kind of start going through your program to come up with your budget. The one thing I'll say about budgeting is it's really important as you write your grant application that you take time to really do this. So this is when you are going to start researching. I need 5 laptops. I want this type of laptop. On the Dell website, they cost this. On this other website, they cost this. So this is my best estimate of what I would spend on laptops. Because funders want to see that you've thought about how to use the funds they're going to award, and they want to see that you're going to use them well. They want to make sure that their money is stretching far and that it's doing what you've said you're going to do with it. So the budget can be kind of a really important part, which is another reason it's good to start with it. So if we're working backwards and you're doing your budget first, then I also recommend doing your summary last. So if your application requires an executive summary or a project summary, what they're asking for is just a paragraph that really tells the funder what your program is trying to do, and why you want funding from them. So once you've got your budget together and you've written all those components that we talked about for the project narrative, your overview, your plan of work, your project implementation plan, any of those things that have to be included, then it's going to actually be a lot easier to write that introductory paragraph. It's just, because you're gonna know your program backwards and forwards. So that's going to be a lot easier to do. Finally, you're almost done. You're ready to submit your grant application. You definitely want to make sure that you've read it over and over and over again. First of all, you don't want to see any silly mistakes. Second, you want to make sure that you've included everything that the grant maker requires, everything that the application is asking for. And third, sometimes you'll find areas where you haven't been the clearest and ways that you can improve that. Now, actually, the best way to do that is to have someone who's completely unfamiliar with your idea read through your project narrative. So when IHLS applied for the NHPRC grant, I actually had two of my colleagues from library school read through our narrative. And it was really helpful because one of them had some questions about parts of our project that she just did not understand. So I knew that I needed to clarify the content in that area. And then another one had really good suggestions about how to reorganize my content in my project narrative to make the flow better and also increase our clarity. I have even had my spouse proof brief project narratives before, because again, someone who is outside of the project may see things that you won't be able to see because you're so close to it. And then I don't have it on this slide, but the other thing I like to do is always make sure that you submit your grant application a couple of days before that final submission date. Almost all grant applications now have to be submitted through an online portal. So you don't want to be trying to get into that online portal at 11:30 a.m. on January 25th if your grant is due at noon on January 25th. You want to do it a couple of days ahead of time. That way, if you have any tech issues, you have lots of time to figure them out. And sometimes if you're doing it on a time crunch, you're going to get stressed out. And even if everything is going smoothly tech-wise, it's really easy for you to forget to upload an additional document. Sometimes at the end, you wind up having to relabel your documents because you'll find out at the end of the application that there's a specific naming convention they want you to use. And if you're doing it last minute, it's also really easy to mislabel items that you have in your application. And I can say that truthfully from experience because I've done it before. So now you know where to find grants and you know basically what to do as you start writing an application. So I just wanted to share a couple more sort of additional tips and tricks. I mentioned earlier that when reading through a NOFO, you may find contact information. If you do, it's a great idea to reach out to the funder before you apply for the grant. One of the reasons I like to do this is because it instantly makes your name and your organization's name or your library's name recognizable to someone who works at that organization that you want grant funding from. And that can only be helpful. Also, usually when you email the contact that you see and get a response, it helps make the whole process feel less intimidating because you feel like you're working with a known entity. So basically, when I reach out, what I do is I usually start with one of those questions that I got when I read through the NOFO. Most often, it's been an eligibility question. So for one funder that we reached out to before we applied, I just wrote an email that said basically, hi, I'm Lesley Zavediuk. I'm working with the Illinois Heartland Library System. We're interested in applying for your name of the grant with this program. And then I maybe put a sentence about the program. And then I said, we think we're eligible for your grant based on your eligibility requirements. But I had a question because I'm not sure which eligibility requirement we fall under. And then I gave details about that. Most of the time, I've gotten an answer back that says, oh, yeah, you're definitely eligible. Please go ahead and apply. But in one instance, it was for a National Endowment of Humanities grant. I asked that question and they said, oh, actually, you're not eligible to apply based on what you've told us, but here are a couple of other opportunities that you might be able to apply for. You should check those out. So in any case, reaching out to the funder before applying, even with just a simple question, is probably going to help you out. A lot of times for federal grants, you can even submit a rough draft about a month before the final deadline. So if you're allowed to do that, you want to make sure that you do it. Anytime that we've done that, we've gotten really good feedback in those instances, and that can only improve your final application. Another tip that I have on here is to partner up. So funders love projects that include partnerships with other organizations because they, in their view, allow their money to go further and to benefit more people. So if you can include a community partnership in your grant application, it immediately adds more value to your application overall. And it's much more likely to get through, again, that first review when the reviewers are looking at the grant applications and sort of just sorting them into read further or not eligible piles. It's more likely to get in that read further pile. I do have one little caveat to that. If you are working with a community partner, if you're working with another organization in your community to make your program happen, make sure that you have clear expectations and boundaries for both parties that are working on that grant project, and that you have mentioned that clearly somewhere in your project narrative. Because grant makers love community partnerships, but they want to know that you're going to work as a team and that you're going to be able to do whatever it is they're funding well and together. And then finally, the last little tip that I have here is you need to tell a story. Grant writing is really just storytelling. So you want to tell a really good story about why you've had this great idea and why it's going to be helpful to your library patrons. And you need to be able to tell that in an impactful way. But along with storytelling, it's also really important to have data that backs up the story that you're telling. So if you are required to submit an executive summary or a project summary, or if you're just doing the first couple paragraphs of your narrative, because it doesn't require a summary, you need to make sure that you're clearly stating a need. So that's going to be the storytelling part. We need these funds because we're doing this thing that our community will benefit from. But then you want to use data to show that those needs are valid. So a lot of times in grant writing, you'll hear about using a hook to kind of like bring your reader in. And I just wanted to show a real quick example of that. And I promise we're going to get to questions here in just a minute. This is just from an ALA toolkit for the Books for Babies grant. This link is included in that additional resources document. But it's just a really good example of storytelling plus data. So you can see in their sort of executive summary, they started with a story. According to the America Reads Challenge, children who enter kindergarten without a book-rich environment enter far beyond children who have books in their homes. Sadly, too many never catch up. So that's their story. Kids who enter kindergarten without books are going to be behind and not catch up. And then for their particular grant program, in Smithville, too many children will be starting school with a terrible handicap. 32% of our children live in poverty, and studies show that families in poverty read less and do less well in school. And they have a footnote. So this is a real statistic that backs up the story that they're telling. And that's why I mentioned early on, as you're thinking about grant opportunities that you want to apply for, that it's really important to think about your target audience, because that's going to help you find those statistics that are going to back up your story. So let me just quickly go back here. And then I do have one more tip that's not on this slide, but that I just wanted to end with. And that is, don't lose heart. So I mentioned a couple of different grants that IHLS applied for in the past year. One was that NHPRC grant. One was the EBSCO Solar grant. And we did not get grant funding from either one of those applications. We've actually submitted several grant applications since I've been working with IHLS, and most of them we have not received funding from. But like I stated before, the more you start filling out grant applications and looking for funding, the easier it becomes. And eventually you're going to hit on a good fit that is going to fund the project that you want to do, which is what we did with the IHLS Mobile Memory Lab and that Illinois Humanities grant. It can be really easy to get sort of disappointed, take it personally, think that you're never going to be able to get grant funding for anything, because grants can be highly competitive and there's only so much money to go around. But you also can't get grants if you don't try to get them. So just always don't get disappointed, don't get discouraged, keep trying, and eventually you will be able to land a grant that's going to fund something amazing for your patrons. So with that, we have about 10 minutes, I think, for questions, and I'm sure Kate was monitoring that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn on my camera so that you can see me at least, even if I can't see all your lovely faces.
Leslie, this is Kate. While we're waiting to see if anybody puts some questions in the chat, the only question that came through was about a copy of the project process form. So I let everybody know that that was currently available in PDF form. I was wondering if we could, and I understand if we need to take off branding or anything like that, but if it'd be possible to have that in a Word document since those are easier to edit.
Yes, I have both the project process form and the kickoff meeting agenda in a Word document, and I will send it to you after this meeting.
Okay, thank
I
you.
just always do PDF because I feel like that's easier to post without it getting like messed up. But I do
Definitely.
have Word files, so I'll send those to you. Oh, you're welcome, Molly. I see in the chat. It's a lot of info, so I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. You could talk about grant writing all day long, because there's just a lot that goes along with it. So hopefully it was not too overwhelming, and you'll find something that will help you in your grant writing journey.
I'm going to go ahead and put the PDH form link in the chat again here in a moment. I want to remind everybody that this is recorded and we will put it on the IHLS Continuing Education Learning Center. Whenever that's available, I will send a link to everyone who registered through L2 with that information on exactly where to find that. I don't see any questions coming through, but I'm seeing a lot of thank yous.
Uh, okay, I'm also I had it on my final slide, but I didn't show you that. So I'm just gonna put my email address in the chat as well. That's also included in that document that I gave to Kate. So you will have it even if you don't think of questions today or you don't get it out of the chat. I'm always happy to answer questions at any time. So if you think of something later, feel free. You can always email me with any question, and I'm happy to respond. Especially, I love talking to librarians from IHLS, especially because I've worked with them for so long. So anytime you want to email me, I'm happy to help. Oh, John, that's a good question. How would you compare the grant writing process to other applications like jobs or scholarships? I would say it's much more in depth. Um, Job applications are pretty much like a set format. So once you start filling them out, like you have all your info and it's right there and you don't usually have to change it a lot. With grant applications, even if you're applying for, maybe you've applied for a grant and you didn't get awarded it, and then you're applying for a different one, but it's the same project. A lot of times you still have to tweak your content to make it fit within the requirements of that grant application. So although it's much longer, I would almost liken it more to writing a cover letter, because you're going to have to change parts of your grant application for each grant that you apply for, whether or not it's the same project. Does that make sense? You're welcome.
Thank you, Leah, for putting the PDH link in there again for everybody. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. We've got about 5 minutes, so I know everybody's processing all of the fabulous information that Lesley gave us this morning. So if you have any questions, we'll stay on for a few more minutes. Leslie, how many grants do you think that you would say that you've written?
Oh my gosh, I have like an actual number somewhere, but probably I'm gonna say between 20 and 30. And like I said, most of those did not receive funding, but that's okay. You just got to keep trying.
I think that was a great point that you brought up too, that,
Yeah.
because a lot of these agencies are getting just who knows how many grants, especially the national ones.
Yeah, and even small private funders, I think grant funding is something that a lot of organizations have needed, more so in the last 5 years than they have ever before. Because like nonprofits are struggling, sometimes other organizations like libraries are working on very small budgets. So I think there's more people applying for grants probably than there used to be, and I also think that grant funding has become, I don't want to say a lot more specific, but there's a lot of funders now that might have used to offer more like general operating grants or like grants for sort of more general projects that now have way more specific guidelines because they want their money to go to this thing that they support or that they believe in. So that can make it a little tricky too, which is why you really want to make sure you find an opportunity that feels like a good fit for what it is you're trying to do.
And I did see a question. Again, this has been recorded. We will provide access to the recording through the IHLS learning page on our website. I will send everyone who registered through L2 an email through L2 when that is available. And it will include Leslie's supplemental materials and a copy of the slides. Okay, so Leslie, thank you again so much for joining us.
You're
I'm going
welcome.
and stop the recording, and